Okay, greetings. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me in this very special panel. Very special because I think it addresses questions in a different way with a different sort of person. We are all interested in the questions, and we ask these questions in different ways. What is the war about? What is the sense of the war? How does one win a war? What does it mean to win? And we have a special opportunity, I think, to ask these sorts of questions to a very special group of writers. We'll speak with Oleg Sentsov, Serhii Zhadan, Stanislav Aseyev, and Yaryna Chornohuz. Yes. All of whom have written extraordinarily prose or poetry or both during and about this war, all of whom I believe would be celebrated writers without this war, but all of whom have something very special to say to us. I personally am struck by how generative this war has been of poetry. It may seem a strange thing to say, but I think that when we think historically about this, I have to go back to the First World War to find a time when so many Europeans were writing so much excellent, memorable poetry during a war, about a war, and the poets also being the warriors. This doesn't always happen, and I think it raises a question, an interesting question, one that the rest of us can think about because the Ukrainians will be too modest to say anything about it. But what does it mean for a nation suffering the threat of genocide to continue to produce its own culture? What does it mean for a nation who is a target for destruction, whose libraries are burned, whose books are burned, whose archives are targeted, whose authors are murdered? What does it mean for that nation to have poets and writers who continue to write excellent poetry and prose during the war? Genocide is about the murder of people, but genocide is also about the destruction of culture. And the survival of a people also involves the survival of a word. We're speaking with poets who can be with us either here in person or, as with Mr. Sentsov, virtually. But we should also remember that there are a number of excellent Ukrainian writers and poets who cannot be with us because they were murdered or killed in action during this war, such as Maxim Krivtsov or the great Ukrainian writer Vika Amelina, who turned from prose to poetry during the war, and who herself was obsessed with the idea of preserving the word, not only her own word, but the word of her fellow writers, so that Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian literature could survive and could bear witness. Our panel today is about the same subject in a way that all the other panels are about. It's about how this war must be won, and I'm sure that our panelists will have something to say about that. Ale ja by також хотів, що ви всі теж думали.
But I also would like to ask every one of you to think together with us about this, because there is also a more profound question. What is the link between the war and poetry? What is the impact of poetry on the war and the other way around? How was it playing out in your individual cases? What influences did you notice in your colleagues and so on?
For me, it's very meaningful to think of Oleg Sentsov being free. 10.5 years ago, I helped to organize a conference here and in the Diplomatic Academy called Myslite z Ukraineyo, Thinking with Ukraine. And during that conference, Mr. Sentsov was abducted, and we had little protests inside and outside our conference, signs saying to free Max Sentsov, free Maxim Sentsov. So it's a special pleasure for me to be able to, Oleg Sentsov, It's a special pleasure for me to be able to speak to Oleg Sentsov virtually. І спитати його,
and to ask him, Oleg, I think you're somewhere around and you can hear me. Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here among such illustrious authors. As regards whether we will prevail, Putin is not the first dictator that our civilization knows, and not the last one for that matter. What makes things even worse, that he is not the only one in the world, and the axis of evil of his friends has already shaped itself. Iran, North Korea, partially China, and Lukashenko, the strongest ally of Putin's. This is very much similar to how the axis of evil was formed before the First and the Second World War. History goes along a spiral, and a lot of things repeat themselves, but in different circumstances. Now we are in the environment of a wider conflict, and we would like to preclude it from growing into a global conflict, because it will be bad for everyone. So in order to preclude that, we need to prevail. We can win over Putin, and we must do so. And we shall do this. Some people thought that we would give up in 2 weeks, but we've proved otherwise, and we've learned to win. But some of our partners are afraid of our victory. They are afraid that Russia will break into many smaller countries which will be beyond their control, and that will result in huge inflows of migrants and so on. And they are also afraid of a nuclear strike from Russia. That is why our partners give us just enough weapons not to lose, but not enough for us to prevail. And this fear that they exhibit, it is abused by any dictator. This is the air that they breathe. This is what the power of dictators are predicated on. People in Russia are afraid of Putin, and people elsewhere are afraid of Putin likewise. The first thing we should do is to stop being afraid of him. The brilliant military operation in Kursk showed that Putin can be beaten on his own territory. And when he's being beaten, he's at a loss. He doesn't know what to do, because he loses the main instrument in his hands, the fear of other people of him. That's why it's absolutely crucial for us not to be afraid of him. We are sure of our victory, and we are sure that we will prevail because we're not afraid of him. And we call upon everyone, don't be afraid of Putin, and this will ensure our shared victory. And this nightmare will come to an end, and the last empire on this planet will be no more. Thank you, and glory to Ukraine. Thank you very much for this answer. I believe the irony, the paradox of this situation lies in the fact that the risks for us in the West will be lower if we are more active. We are afraid of risks, but if we do more and do it faster, the risks will go down.
Хочете відповідати?
Would you like to respond?
I'd like to turn now to Stanislav Aseyev. And I would like to take a moment to introduce some of his work to those of you who are not familiar with him. Stas Aseyev was an underground reporter during the first occupation of the Donbass. He was arrested and imprisoned in what is perhaps the single worst Russian concentration camp, at least at the time, and was in prison for nearly 2 years and saw and experienced horrifying things, which he was able to summarize in a very important book, which is available in English, called The Torture Camp on Paradise Street. I think one of the most important books, one of the most important nonfiction books for those of us who read in English about the first part of the war. Stanislav Aseyev, like a number of other Ukrainian writers, once he was freed in a prisoner exchange, as was Mr. Sentsov, joined the armed forces of Ukraine. Так що, Стас, питання загальне. Якщо хочете про перемогу...
I have a general question to you. What is your definition, general definition of victory? But if you would like to speak about a link between being a writer and being a soldier, so please. Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon. I think the second part of your question is simpler for me because I started writing a new book when I was at the front line already. When you're in trenches, you are at war 24/7, and all you have to do is to write some notes in your smartphone. The battlefield and the military situation gives a lot of information for writers, which might sound kind of counterintuitive, but and even cynical. But we are aware of numerous examples about world writers who became famous because they were perceived as military writers, as it were, or wartime writers. This is also directly related to the issues of victory. From the very first day, after I came to the front line, I had a feeling that we're fighting against some obviousness. For a person in trenches and for people who are being attacked by the Russian enemy, everything is obvious. It is obvious what we're dealing with, that we are fighting against someone who unleashed a war to destroy us, a war of genocide. But when you go beyond the limits of this information war, the trenches, and if you take a look at the networks, especially in the West, you see that there is no obviousness that you perceive as obvious. Because even if many people, therefore, think like, why don't we sit at a negotiating table with Russia and make a deal? Even though for us the situation is very straightforward. It's either us or them. End of story. And for me, as a writer and a military serviceman, I have an impression that one of the key problems here is the absence, or the lack, rather, for the Western consumers, the lack of obviousness related to this war. What is obvious to us is not necessarily obvious to them. And as a person who writes kind of different reports from the front line, the challenge is to show this conflict as one of the world conflicts currently going on, be it in the Middle East, in in Syria and so on. And for them, this is kind of a 5-minute war for the television. But whereas for the people who are under fire all the time, everything looks quite differently. And the problem for writers and for people of arts in general is to overcome this barrier, the disconnect between the reality, obviousness, and the lack thereof in the West, because we are very dependent on assistance and support from the West, and it is very much dependent on the general perception of this war among Western citizens, be it Germans, Brits, Americans, whoever. That's what I have to say about that.
This is a very interesting thought about the obvious or obviousness, oczyvidnost, because a classical task of literature is to take what is obvious and make it strange so that we notice it. But what Aseyev is speaking about is the ability of literature to take what is obvious to one set of people and convey it to another. And that sounds like a simple thing, but it's not at all. The anthropological realities are so very different, and it's a challenge to the word to get from one reality to another reality. And I want to return to this theme, but I want to make sure that all of us have a chance to speak first. Yaryna Chornohuz has asked that I ask the question in English, but the question is the same, and it's very general. If you'd like, please answer our session's question about victory and why we must have victory, but please, if you could also, with respect to your own poetry, tell us what you feel comfortable telling us about the relationship between war and poetry, the ability of poetry to convey something about war, which perhaps other forms of creativity cannot.
Thank you for this question. Hello, everybody. I can say this about poetry and war. When you are on the front line and you are a soldier, or you are a combat medic, you are reconnaissance, or anyone, you feel two things. First thing that you are feeling that you are acting person, you are the one who defend your country, you're the one who have braveness, but at the same time, especially if you had a few years on the front line, you feel yourself very small. You do a really big job, yes, but war as a big giant makes, especially the war like Russians imposed us, you feel yourself small, just like lots of civilians in our cities. And poetry is a thing which helps you in this condition to be human again. Genre of poetry is a literature genre of maybe the greatest humanism, I think. It makes anyone who writes it feel himself actually human, feel himself or herself in connection with all history, with your nations, with all generation of artists who were before. Thus, the poetry in wartime is a documentation of your feelings and very terrible conditions of loss and hard truths about war. I can say about poetry also this thing. When I was in my vacation on the poetry festival in one of the European cities, I was asked by the audience, so how do you feel actually as Ukrainian and poet and military and artist on the front line? And I said that, we feel loneliness, a really great loneliness. And then I was accepted with a great honor there. They asked, why do you feel yourself such a lonely? We give you so much support, we give you weapons. We right now change our thoughts about culture and literature. We try to understand what was Russian, what was Ukrainian without appropriation. So why do you feel loneliness? And I answered that I'm grateful for all of this, but the fact is the world still nothing can do with this war. It's 11th year, and the world which knows that actually this war is a great threat for all democratic world, for all Europe, can do nothing about it, cannot give enough weapons to stop them, cannot have strong position to stop it. And there is one more thing that I want to say. I want to share actually one situation that I had like on the front line with my unit. In May 2022, not May, but April 2022, when we were near combats for Popasna, there was a family with 5 kids who came to us, to our unit, and asked for evacuation. Like that, it was a village, Klinovo, if someone knows about this village, from which it was very difficult to go. And we helped them with evacuation, like volunteers came, brought us some food, and on the way back, they took this young family and their 5 kids. The eldest kid was actually 5 years old. And I asked the man, like the father of this family, if he isn't afraid to change, like to throw his, house, yes, in small Donetsk village and go away somewhere with 5 kids. He said, no, I'm not scared because I know that after every war there is a period of prosperity, and I'm going to meet that in Ukraine, in the center, in the West Ukraine, or even in the East Ukraine, where I came back. So I always think about these words of him. And talking about poetry, our best poetry in our Ukrainian literature we had, in my opinion, like the best artists, the best poets, we had 100 years ago, when we also were fighting for our freedom and independence. So now the result of when we get victory, we will have in Ukraine lots of beautiful artists again, lots of beautiful poets, and lots of beautiful voices, and we will have prosperity again. And I really like to survive to see all of it.
I should have said that Yaryna Chornohuz was a volunteer medic with the hospitals before enlisting as a regular medic in Ukrainian Armed Forces, where she has served as a medic, but also as a scout. Thank you very much, Yaryna. The idea that we are alone, but being alone with poetry is different than being alone without it. Thank you for that. Serhii Zhadan is a Ukrainian creator who needs no introduction. A person who could serve as the culture of an entire country. It's easy to imagine a country which was called Zhadanina, in which there was a musician Zhadan and a rapper Zhadan and a charismatic speaker Zhadan and a novelist Zhadan and a poet Zhadan. This man, so Serhii Zhadan, I think of Serhii Zhadan as a radical young writer. He's a radical, slightly less young writer than he was when I first began to read him a couple of decades ago. But he has an astonishing record of novels and poetry already, deserving, I believe, of vast international recognition. Serhii Zhadan was a documenter of the east of Ukraine in the 1990s in his prose. he said he took the decision, having been a supporter of Hartia, which is a brigade of the Terobrona, having been a supporter of Hartia and one of the formulators of its ideas and its mission, to formally enlist several months ago. So Serhiju, tak zahalne pytanie takoż do tebe.
So just a general question to you, Sergei. Maybe you could talk about the meaning behind victory, but maybe you could also react to what your colleagues already have said, like about the link with poetry. Maybe you could speak about the link with prose, or maybe what are you working on, or what has changed. Yeah, thank you a lot. I'll pick where my colleagues have left, to tell not about the meaning of the victory, but rather about the risk of possible failure. Very much important. Those talks about when and how we will win. I'd rather speak about why we might not win in this conflict. It's very important to understand the following. We are fantasizing, allowing ourselves into strategic fantasizing, but we think and dream about the failure and the defeat of our enemy. And we are quite rather afraid or superstitiously mum about potential defeat of ours. Meanwhile, it may be a decisive or rather important factor of why we have no right to defeat. We, with my colleagues, all three of us, are Ukrainian servicemen, Ukrainian writers, people who position themselves as Ukrainians. Clearly, in the case of Ukraine's defeat, not necessarily a military one, but diplomatic, political, so on, neither like Ukrainian writers nor in any other format, we will have no chance to remain here. There will be no future for us without the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian culture, and the level of our risks and potential losses is much greater than that of the invader, because the invader always has an option to leave their taken territory. We have nowhere to go, because ultimately we will then lose everything. Because of that, a different level of motivation and completely different level of engagement in this. When people talk about war, assessing chances of the parties, we speak about objective things related to human resource and potential, economic, political potential, but we seldom think about how diehard can be those who have little or nothing to lose. People who are not ready to just give up. Maybe they have less than the enemy, but still this is something that is theirs. So, and many times these factors are at play and become decisive ones. This is like, David versus Goliath. Sometimes people miss with the bets on the results. Like Oleg said, those forecasts with Ukraine being given days, weeks to survive, those forecasts were done by people who've never looked into one's potential to stand up against the enemy, to defend his life, his family, home, and so on, without any political gains, but just to survive. So, when it comes to how we are going to prevail, it's rather a question to be left for military professionals. Now, the second thing regarding poetry, what Yaryna mentioned, and Stanislav too, speaking of poetry, literature, and in a broader sense, culture at the time of war, lot is being said, lot has been said, many things are just on the surface of it, but we tend to forget about one important matter, this, well, literature and culture at the time of war. We tend to look at it in a utilitarian way. We tend to support it, if not materially, then morally at least. But again, it's about, some like stringer-like reports, some real-time things. We try to conserve in that way our emotions for posterity, and this is really important. This is one of the functions, social functions of the culture, particularly in circumstances like these at war. But still, there is one thing that is not so obvious, I'd say, and we are doing circles around it. It's about the culture being an important marker of the war itself, the marker of this standoff, the marker of this huge conflict that is going on and boiling for more than a decade. This is the marker, which is more important than the very existence of Ukrainian, institutions. We talked with Vitaly Portnikov on that, about this war being of distance nature. It's really unlikely that the Russian army or Russian politicians dream about finally winning a city like Pokrovsk or some Kharkiv suburb. I think they're rather thinking about destroying the very notion of Ukraine and being Ukrainian. It's even not about restoring the Ukrainian SSR. It's rather about destroying everything which goes against the fur of the Russian world. Everything that is against it has to be destroyed, and this is not a euphemism. This is what is clear from the analysis of things being done in the past years. The Russians, when occupying some territories, always destroy every sign of Ukrainian presence, and Ukrainian culture is one of the markers they look for. Just check the cities and towns occupied by Russians. I am monitoring it all the time. Those Donetsk, Luhansk areas. We had been quite active there before the start of the big war. We had good knowledge of their culture and educational system. All those things were effectively erased by Russians. Schools, libraries, culture centers, so on. Everything was razed to the ground in a principled and very, sequential, step-by-step way, which is about a clear marker regarding also our culture. It is not about one's capacity or incapacity, creative capacity to write prose or poetic things. It's about you, whether you write poetry or prose, are a carrier of something which is alien to Russian understanding. And because of that, you have to cease to be. So Russians are against us as people that speak Ukrainian, those who position themselves as citizens of another country. So ultimately, it's about the importance of those cultural markers that we tend to underestimate or take too lightly, In continuation of the topic of why we cannot be defeated, because if so, the whole area will be erased, destroyed, and dead, and all restoration of the Ukrainian spirit will be postponed until many centuries after. So I think that this war somehow organically unites people's will to defend themselves, their territory, their idea, their values, and the future. And from here, I think the presence of poetry as an idea, as a metaphor at war, it's a natural thing. This war could not have happened without the Ukrainian language, the Ukrainian history, the Ukrainian values, because this is the war for values.
I think this idea that Ukrainians don't have the right to lose is one that the rest of us should think about, because very often when we think about freedom and rights, what we have in mind is we can do whatever we want. We can help Ukraine, we cannot help Ukraine, we can do what we feel like. But there's another idea of freedom which says we have certain values. In following those values, we end up at a certain place where we have no right to do anything else. And I think it behooves us in the rest of the world who perhaps have different ideas of freedom to consider this idea that sometimes free people have no right to do anything but what they're doing at that moment. So I very much appreciate that idea, and I hope that we can keep reflecting on it. A second thing I wanted to speak about, listening to Serhii, I wanted to address it directly, is what I think of as an incredible modesty of Ukrainian writers. I think Ukrainians are far too modest about the achievements of Ukrainian, filmmakers, artists, poets, novelists, plastic artists, sculptors, especially since 2014. Yaryna spoke of the great achievements of Ukrainian writers decades ago, and one can have conversations about what the best decade was. The 1920s were pretty good. There were some good things in the 1960s. The 1820s have something to say for them. But I think the 10 years since 2014 have actually been the most impressive period in Ukrainian culture. And I think Ukrainians should probably be less modest about this, or at least the rest of us should be more aware of things like this. I feel like we spend too much of our time, we meaning both the rest of us and Ukrainians, we spend too much of our time worrying about Russian high culture and too little of our time celebrating the incredible achievements of young Ukrainian culture in the last 10 years. So I just want to note that. That would have been true without the war. Since Maidan, Ukrainian culture has been incredibly, incredibly impressive. And then the third thing, і можемо це зрозуміти як питання.
My question to all of you, then, maybe I'll start with Stanislav. When I listen to Serhii, I think, yes, he speaks about Ukrainianship or the essence of being Ukrainian. But in fact, this subjectivity is a problem to the Russian government. But and this idea is very close to the Ukrainian literature, but it is also very close to humanity, very close to our subjectivity. When you speak about the essence of Ukrainian literature, I think that Russian politics should be against this Ukrainianship, because Ukrainian culture to all of us is very close to the agency of the Ukrainian people. I don't know whether you guess what I mean, but I hope you can respond. Yes, indeed, we are now in an informational reality where the victory of Ukrainian idea is the victory to all of us, because it's the main idea of the Russian civilization that there is no Ukrainian culture per se. So when it comes to culture, literature in particular, they say, oh, we have got Dostoevsky and Pushkin and all those great writers, but you have Shevchenko and that would be it. Perhaps sometimes they also mention Lesya Ukrainka. And this narrative goes beyond the federal TV channels and it reaches out to the Western audiences. And when you speak to those and ask them about the Ukrainian cultural context in France, say in Germany, in the US, people fail to mention at least one cultural figure from Ukraine, but they would always talk about the Russian culture and how can we cancel this great culture, all those writers, composer, etc. It is essential that Ukrainian voices are heard so that Ukrainian masterpieces are recognized and celebrated at different festivals and contests, etc. And today, this war gives us a new impetus for the Ukrainian culture, and it is essential for the world to pay attention, to start translating those works, and perhaps to post some of our poems in social media so that you educate the palette for Ukrainian culture and literature. The best films, the best literature about the war is not essentially about the war. It is about some metaphysical content. It shows through the lens of the war the evolution of a human being, something that is irreversible, something that stays with a person even in the post-war peaceful life, but it has an indelible impact on our lives and on our culture in general. So in this sense, I think we have got very powerful achievements in the Ukrainian art, in Ukrainian literature, in Ukrainian culture that will stay. It is with us to stay after the war for good.
I want to rephrase my question in another language. When we hear Russians say there's no Ukrainian culture, we from the outside might think, well, that sounds like a Russian-Ukrainian dispute. The Russians say they have no culture, the Ukrainians say they do have culture. And then our next step might be to say, well, let's evaluate this dispute. Let's see if the Ukrainians have culture. Let's make them prove to us that they have culture. And what I want to suggest is that that is very profoundly missing the point. Of course, Ukrainians have culture, and it's fabulously interesting culture. In the third decade of the 21st century, Ukrainian culture is fabulously interesting. But in a sense, that's beside the point. When Russians say there is no Ukrainian culture, what they are really saying is there is no such thing as culture. There is no such thing as values. That's what they're really saying when they say there's no Ukrainian culture. It's a message which applies to everyone, and not just like so many things in this war, not just to Ukraine. So now I'm putting my thesis in a slightly bolder way, and Yaryna, do with it as you wish.
Yes. In my life, I can say that I felt that like Russia tried to destroy our identity and culture from my very childhood. I remember all these 30 years of our independence, which were absolutely like looked in other, I think, for all of the world. But for us, this years of independence after which they attacked us, they really prepared like this all things to, they imposed us complex of national inferiority. They said that Ukrainian language is bad language, that Russian is the main language, not Ukrainian, that if you speak Ukrainian, you cannot be educated person. So I remember everything that from my very childhood, being a kid and explaining to lots of people that why do I speak Ukrainian and all of this. So they were preparing for a long time for what happened in 2013 and what happened in 2022. And right now, our voice as artists for the world, I think that we bring some very important messages for all the free world, Europe, US, all free world. It means these messages, they are about that, how to fight, actively fight, actually, for your existence, because we as Serhii and Stanislav say, yes, we are fighting for our ability to live in freedom, not living in concentration camp, in the camp of torture, which Stanislav described in his book, and how to fight with this and to be, again, democratic society, to talk about art and this. So I feel a big gap between us and Europeans, in meaning that we are living with this war alone, and lots of people in the world, they think it's just just a conflict, nothing special, and they don't really understand the sense of afterlife in which live all of our society. They also do not understand sometimes that Russians have a big resource, a huge resource, and every year of this very long decade war, they try to break our will to fight. Because to win the war means to break the will of the nation to fight. And I can say that lots of our militaries, and us, we are tired after long rotations. But we understand that we have actually no choice. We can only fight to the end, and actually I am preparing even my kid for she would be a soldier one day if it won't stop, if we won't stop it.
So before we come to a close, I'd like to take one question from the audience and give the three of you, perhaps beginning with Serhii, a chance to respond. We have Andrei Shevchenko, who leads the Ukrainian Football Federation. Proszę was.
Thanks a lot for this opportunity. It's my great pleasure to see you here, Professor Stanislav, Serhii, Yaryna. I echo all of your words, and I particularly agree with Serhii, who said that we have no right and we cannot possibly lose in this war, because the world should appreciate that it is a war of survival to us. It is existential war to us. Every day, Ukrainians are being killed. And I want the world to start at last making very practical steps that will help us change the course of this war. We need true support. We don't need rhetoric, however correct. I've been traveling of late very intensely, talking to people inside the country and in the greater world. And when I talk to people in the neighboring countries, people there seem to appreciate what to expect if Ukraine fails. And they offer very, very strong support. But those who live farther can't still understand that it is a matter to the entire world, and it is essential that the world should make very practical steps to change this situation. Thank you very much. Andrei, thank you very much for your kind words. I do agree with you, nothing to add. And the most awful thing is that lots of our countrymen and countrywomen are being killed, and we cannot even fathom this huge price that we are paying for our existence, for our culture, and the world somehow seems indifferent, cynical, or lacking empathy. And I understand that the world of the sport, athletes, people from culture can be our ambassadors, should actually get this message through to people in other countries. And every prize or medal that our athlete or writer or, say, cinematographist wins is yet another reminder that there is Ukraine. You shouldn't stop discussing this war. You shouldn't stop supporting Ukraine, working together to putting an end to this war. Can I comment on culture now? It's an extremely interesting topic, and I would like to elaborate on it. Yaryna said that 100 of years ago, Ukraine had its best poetry. It was really generation of romantics and revolutionaries who wanted to create impossible, to create this structure of Ukrainian nature when the statehood lost.
But that was unbelievably bold as a gesture, but now it is. It has definitely failed, or it had failed 100 years ago. We ended up with big-scale repressions. We have to learn our lesson from that. So sometimes the history of our culture is more instructive than a history of parliamentarism or economic development, for that matter. It points to the very structure, the skeleton of the society. Our history teaches us that culture is always doomed to failure, destined to be forgotten without statehood. If you do not have a state institutions, that skeleton or that structure, no genius can oppose the system. You can take any example like Taras Shevchenko, Lesa Ukrainka, Ivan Franko, for that matter. One way or another, the most rational way for culture to operate is in the situation of statehood. And now we can see a very expressive token of this very argument. It's not just passive resistance, or some playing with deceiver on honest terms. And we are changing the association culture. This is not just a flash or a splash or change of dynamics. It's the complete change of the rules of the game. For the first time since the Middle Ages, seriously speaking, the Ukrainian culture is fully present, omnipresent, functionally in the Ukrainian society. The Ukrainian culture has broken loose from its ghetto. It's now a culture of the whole society. The Russians were not prepared. I'm sure they wouldn't believe it. And some part of the Ukrainians were not ready. But this is unstoppable. This cannot be closeted anymore. This is Ukrainian culture as omnipresent normalcy. It can slow down, it can speed up. We can imagine some inner or external incentives for that, but one way or another, this is clearly the case when the number transformed into quality, quantity into quality, and we have to live with that. And that is the game changer, because this is a great challenge for the Ukrainian culture itself, just how potent it is to act not in resistance, but in the conditions of expansion, how ready we are to cooperate, to collaborate with all the strata of the Ukrainian society. This is for the first time we are putting this to test. And it seems to me that the Ukrainian culture has passed this test with flying colors. But this is the conclusion we draw, the lesson we learn and have to remember forever. All this is only possible with blocking of the Russian impact. As soon as we plug this hole, we discover that we have everything. The books for the shows of the bookshops, lineups of the festivals enough not to need any Russian curators. We have a lot of culture. We just had to close the valve, so to speak. And the Ukrainian culture can be a good suit to follow for the Ukrainian politics. In the Ukrainian politics, we can imagine a total different quality. With the economics, the same. As soon as we remove their influence from our economy, we can expect much. The church, other components of a normal society. This is something that seemed not so obvious. It's not about the Russian books, they would say, but in fact, this is a very important marker of the occupation and colonialism. As soon as we localize it, make it marginal, we play at home, and the initiative is ours, using football terms. Some closing words, Stanislav. Very difficult to add anything. I fully agree with Serhii. We either discover the laws of this universe or form the laws of this universe. Of course, we can create the new content, but we just had to remember that we had everything necessary for that. Yaryna? Yes, it's.
Serhii, yes, I absolutely agree with that. Actually, I'm really proud to be artist in this generation. I really like the fact that lots of militaries, they are writing poetry now. They are writing very different kinds of arts right now. And as we know from the European literature, there are lots of European artists who became artists because they were at the beginning a soldier, because this is maybe the only nice consequence of war, that the hard initiation of war opens these artistic voices. And yes, I believe that the voice of our art right now, the voice of our literature becomes very very organic. What I mean that, like, for me, it seems that first years of our independence, we were under influence of Russia. Like, Russia were everywhere in mass media, and yes, they had this very funny images of Ukrainians, and we had to, like, our art was the only thing which actually tried to destroy it. Like, why politicians played in this game, like, with this pro-Russian culture, which was, like, broadcasting from the TV. But our artists were the one who destroyed it, like, trying to destroy it. And right now in these decades, I feel like we are organic. We, like, don't need to compare us anymore to, like, any Russian narrative, to any artistic narrative. We are very existentialistic in our art and very organic. So I really like that about this process, and I think it will be even more when lots of people return from this war.
So as an American at public events, I always try to remember to thank Ukrainians in general and the Ukrainian armed forces and the Terobrone and all the brigades in particular for allowing me and so many others to lead the normal life that I lead. I think we take this for granted and it ought to be acknowledged. But here I also have the special opportunity to thank українським письменникам за те, що я також можу бути письменником. Я не був би цим письменником.
Ukrainian writers that I can be a writer. Without the Ukrainian literature, I couldn't have become a writer myself.
Combatant writers with us, and I hope you will join me in thanking them very, very warmly.